Good morning, Lakeside. So good to see you. Let's stand and worship together. 1, 2, 3, 4. I was buried beneath my shame. Who can carry that kind of weight? It was my tomb till I met you, and I was breathing but not alive. All my failures I tried to hide. It was my tomb till I met you. You called my name, and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness, into your glorious day. You called my name, and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness, into your glorious day. Now your mercy has saved my soul. Now your freedom is all that I know. The old made new, Jesus, when I met you. Oh, you called my name, and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness, into your glorious day. You called my name, and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness, into your glorious day. I needed rescue, my sin was heavy, but chains break at the weight of your glory. I needed shelter, I was an orphan, now you call me a citizen of heaven. When I was broken, you were my healing. Now your love is the air that I'm breathing. I have a future, my eyes are open. It's when you call my name, I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness, into your glorious day. You called my name, and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness, into your glorious day. All right, good morning, everyone. We have just a couple of announcements really quick, so if you want to have a seat, we will get these going. So first off, while we have everyone here, we want to make sure that all families that are here in person, as well as those who are watching from the stream, know that during today's message, as well as the rest of the messages for the remainder of the month, may not be suitable for children. For those families that are here, we have programs for kids all the way through 5th grade. And for those of you watching from home, when it comes to the message, it may be best to have your children out of the room when we go into that. So also, our Lakeside Help Wanted page is live on the website. So on it, we have listed all the serving opportunities that are currently available here at Lakeside. And it's a great way serving is to grow closer to Jesus and to connect with other people while using your talents and your gifts and your abilities. So there's a lot of great ways to serve in and through Lakeside. throughout the week. And you're invited to check those out at lakeside-church.com/help. So check those out. If you have any questions, you can contact the office for sure. And it's the most wonderful time of the year, which means snow's coming, right? So it's going to be here before we know it. And speaking of serving and helping out, one way to help out is to be a snow shoveler. Before we know it, it's going to be here, and the sidewalks are going to be filled with snow, and we're going to need help clearing those off for our weekend services. If you would like to help out with that, if you're interested, you can contact the office, and we'll get you in touch with all the right people to get that ball rolling. So please stay updated with everything that's going on here at Lakeside. You can do that by checking out our social media spots, our website, as well as signing up for our e-news. On the tables in the back, we have the connection cards. You can fill that out, fill out prayer requests, drop that in the box. If you have any questions on getting connected, that's a great way to do it. Also, if you're new here, if this is your first time, we want to welcome you. Thank you so much for being here. You can fill out those connection cards as well, save them and hand them into the coffee bar at the end of the service, and we have a special gift for you as just our way of saying thank you. If you're watching from the stream, there's ways that you can do this as well on the website as well as the streaming page. We also want to thank everyone who's been given financially to Lakeside. Your gifts have enabled us to keep the heat on now that the temperatures are starting to drop. Hooray for that. So thank you so much for giving. If you would like to give, there's ways to do that. You can fill out an envelope on the back of the tables and drop them into the donation boxes. You can send a check into the mail through the mail to the church. Streaming options, there's ways to do this on our page as well. So that's all the announcements. Let's stand and worship together. You unravel me with a melody, and you surround me with a song of deliverance from my enemies, till all my fears are gone, and I'm no longer a slave to fear, 'cause I am a child of God. I'm no longer a slave to fear, 'cause I am a child of God. From my mother's womb, you have chosen me. Love has called my name. I've been born again into your family. Your blood flows through my veins, and I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. And I am surrounded by the arms of the Father. And I am surrounded by songs of deliverance, and we've been liberated from our bondage, and we're the sons and the daughters. So let us sing our freedom. between us. How high the mountain I could not climb. In desperation, I turned to heaven and spoke your name into the night. And through the darkness, your loving kindness tore through the shadows of my soul. The work is finished, the end is written. Jesus Christ, my living hope. Who could imagine so great a mercy? What heart could fathom such boundless grace? The God of ages stepped down from glory to wear my sin and bear my shame. The cross has spoken, I am forgiven. The King of Kings calls me his own. Beautiful Savior, I'm yours forever. Jesus Christ, my living hope. Hallelujah, praise the one who set me free. Hallelujah, death has lost its grip on me. You have broken every chain. There's salvation in your name, Jesus Christ, my living hope. Hallelujah, He's the one who set me free. Hallelujah, death has lost its grip on me. You have broken every chain. There's salvation in your name, Jesus Christ, my living hope. Then came the morning that sealed the promise. Your very body began to breathe, and out of the silence, the roaring lion declared the grave has no claim on me. Then came the morning that sealed the promise. Your very body began to breathe. Now out of the silence, the roaring lion declared the grave has no claim on me. Jesus, yours is the victory. Oh, hallelujah, praise the one who set me free. Hallelujah,
We were at a restaurant, and it was us and a couple of people that we knew really well. And then they'd invited some friends, and they'd invited some friends. And before you know it, all throughout the section were a bunch of people that went to school together, but not everybody that was in the same circle of friends. But it was fun, and it got really loud, and we were in high school at the time, so it got really energetic, and everybody was having a great time, ate food. And then once the food was all eaten, then the boredom set in, and that's when you run into trouble with a bunch of students. It's always when the boredom sets in, and that's what had happened. And all of a sudden, out of the corner of our eye, we see two guys who went to school together, who were friends, but decide they were going to turn the Mexican restaurant into a wrestling arena. And they just started wrestling in the middle of the place. And as soon as we saw them hit the table and the drinks spill everywhere and the salsa just pouring onto the floor, a couple of us made eye contact and said, "It's time to go. It's time to go. Let's just go." Because it's not gonna get any better from this point on. And the dinner got out of control, and we made it out early, but we saw exactly where this was heading, and it wasn't heading anywhere good, and we just decided it's time to go. It's just easier that way. It's just easier, and so that's what we did. We left. This morning we're going to look at a dinner party. And a dinner party, if you grew up in church, you may be somewhat familiar with it. You may have been told a version of this growing up. Maybe in Sunday school you had a teacher talk to you about it. You were maybe told a very sanitized version of what happened. But we're going to be looking at a party that gets out of control in Daniel chapter 5. So if you have your phones or your tablets, we'd invite you to follow along with us in the Bible app on Daniel chapter 5. That's where we're going to be this morning. But I want to let you know what's going on. A little bit of backstory before we dive right in. At this point, Israel has been in captivity for 70 years. Israel's been in captivity for 70 years. Nebuchadnezzar, a king of Babylon, a very successful king of Babylon, he has now died. He has now died. And Daniel doesn't really record anything for us between the death of Nebuchadnezzar and the scene we're going to see in Daniel chapter 5. This is kind of a dead space. But we know from historical accounts exactly what had happened. When Nebuchadnezzar died, his son ruled for 2 years. And then his son was taken out by his brother-in-law. His brother-in-law killed him after 2 years, and then his brother-in-law ruled for 4 years, and then he died. And then his son took over, and he was in charge for less than a year, and he was then assassinated. And one of the assassins then became king, who then married one of Nebuchadnezzar's either daughters or widows. We're not really sure which, but all of that happened, and now they have a son named Belshazzar. And you think we have political problems in this country. That's the background. That's the background for where we jump in to Daniel chapter 5, verse 1, where we read these words. Now King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine in front of the 1,000. King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Now Belshazzar ruled Babylon, while his father or stepfather, whatever the case may be, ruled the rest of the kingdom from Arabia. But Belshazzar ruled from Babylon. He's assembled there in Babylon. He throws a great feast where there are at least 1,000 royal officials there, and you figure all of their entourages are on scene as well. So this is a giant feast that King Belshazzar is throwing. But there's more to this than meets the eye. There's more to this than meets the eye. While this feast is happening, the Medes and the Persians have surrounded the city of Babylon. The Medes and the Persians have the city surrounded, and they're already attacking all the other strongholds of the kingdom. These are the kingdom's end days. But it's not just a dinner. It's not just a feast. What's happening inside is a drunken orgy. That's what's going on in this room. It's not like everybody's seated down for a nice steak dinner and everybody's seated and they've got all of the china set up and they're working from the out in, because that's apparently what you do. But that's not what's happening. That's not what's happening. I mean, this is a rave before there were raves. It is an orgy that's going on in the hall. There is food, and people are getting wasted, they're getting drunk, and there's sex everywhere that you look, and people are hooking up with multiple people. There's food, there's drugs, there's alcohol, there's sex. I mean, this is nothing new. This is nothing new. They're the same problems that plague us as a society and a culture today, but it's nothing new. It's not unique to our culture. This has been going on literally since the world was created. What are they doing? They're throwing a party. Because that's one of the ways that people cope with crazy. One of the ways that people cope when there's nothing else that they can see and nowhere else for them to turn is to just turn it off. And never mind the fact that the city is surrounded by armies everywhere that you look. And they probably did have some false sense of security because they lived in a really impressive city. And so maybe they did have some false sense of security, like they're not going to be able to defeat us. Or maybe they just realized the end is near. Whatever the case may be, they're throwing a party and they're eating to their heart's content. They're drinking to their heart's content. They're sleeping with anyone and everyone that they want to. It's food, it's sex, it's drugs, it's alcohol, and it's nothing new. The question that we just need to pause and ask ourselves right now is, how are we coping with crazy? How are we coping with crazy? Now, I'm willing to guess most of us haven't rented out a room and thrown an orgy, but the question is, how are we coping? Are we finding our comfort in food? Has the one glass of wine turned to a bottle? Are we starting to access material on our phone or on our laptop? We make sure we delete right away. Are we so looking for just a reprieve? We start to abuse substances. The question that all of us have to confront right now is, how are we handling this? What are we turning to? And the most dangerous things oftentimes are those that are so subtle. The most dangerous thing for most of us, not all of us, but the most dangerous thing for most of us is not to find ourselves in the midst of the pandemic right now to think, I'm going to start meth. Now's a great time to start meth. That's not for most of us. And for most of us, the temptation is, what's a third piece of cake? It's all right. Or what's the next glass of wine? For some, the temptation very much so is to go back fully into the throes of addiction. So we're not making fun of meth usage or anything else, but very few people is that the starting point. But if you've already reached the starting point and you've gone past that, then certainly you find yourself there and asking, is this what's next? We find ourselves in the midst of a chaotic, crazy time. And the temptation for all of us, to varying degrees, is to find a way to numb that pain, to find a way to numb the uncertainty. Belshazzar and his crowd's answer was a giant orgy where there was food and there were drinks, and there was anything your heart or your eyes could want. And Belshazzar, verse 2, continues, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of the silver that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Belshazzar gets drunk. And in the midst of that, he remembers the temple instruments that had been taken when the city was ransacked, when the Israelites were drug off into captivity. And those temple instruments that were used to worship God had been sitting in a display. And he goes and he gets them And he brings them down out of the museum, and he brings them and he introduces those instruments which were used to worship God, and he introduces them into the drunken orgy. And then they brought in the golden vessels, verse 3 says, that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. No one's stopping the destructive course. No one is stopping this. Belshazzar is drunk, and he gets this idea. And nobody who's in that room, nobody who's in the midst of the party says, might not be the best idea. Maybe we shouldn't do that. Nobody stops. Nobody says a word. This is why it is so important that you have people in your life who are willing to make you upset, who are willing to allow you to get mad at them in order for them to speak the truth into your life. This is vital. And when you don't have people in your life who love you enough to allow you to be mad at them for telling you the things you don't want to hear, you are setting yourself up for failure. And it can't always be your spouse. You need to find somebody in your life who loves you enough, who is willing to tell you the truth, especially in the times you don't want to hear it. And nobody says a word. Nobody interrupts. Nobody does anything. And Belshazzar doesn't have that. And then verse 5 introduces us to a scene that gets even weirder. Immediately, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, opposite the lampstand, and the king saw the hand as it wrote. Now, we know Belshazzar is not in the clearest mindset, so we don't know if he thinks he's hallucinating. We don't know what but he's staring at this hand that has now appeared out of nowhere, and a hand, and only a hand, is floating in the air, and it is writing on the wall. We don't know how many glasses he's had at this point. We don't know exactly what was in that wine. All we know is Belshazzar sees a hand that is writing on the wall, and the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. The whole tone of his evening changes from one of debauchery and celebration and do whatever feels good. And in that momentary high of I'm going to pursue whatever my flesh desires, he's on that kick and it's feeling good. He's feeling great. And then he sees the hand. And everything changes. Everything changes. The color just drains out of his flesh. His mind begins to race. His thoughts are all over the place. His limbs, they lose all of their strength. His knees, they're knocked together. He's about to faint because of what he has seen. And the king called loudly, and the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck and shall be the third ruler of the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed. So now we know this isn't just a king seeing something that he's drunk, thinking, "Oh, I'm seeing something." This is something he's now called in the wisest of people that he has at his disposal. He's called in the people who could solve all of the riddles, the magicians and the people who had wisdom, and he's brought all of them in, and he's looking around and he's telling all of his advisors, tell me what this says, and they're looking at it and they're verifying this is very real. This is not a hallucination. This is not in your mind. This is real, and we don't know. we got nothing for you. And he's saying, no, listen, I will make you royalty. You will be up to the third in the kingdom. I will take care of you financially. I will give you whatever your heart could possibly desire. I need to know what this message says. And none of them could answer. And again, we see that the king is spiraling. He's freaking out, and even more so when no one who he could previously count on in terms of his advisors could now come to him and give him the answer. This forces us to ask another question of ourselves: is where do we go and who do we turn to in times of uncertainty? Where do we go and who do we turn to in times of uncertainty? The king turned to all of the people who he'd been able to count on previously, and none of them could help. And now the queen comes in the room. The queen came back in the room, and we're just going to summarize these next few verses. And she said, relax. You don't need to worry about it. Relax, don't worry about it. Your father, and we're not sure whether it was his official father or whether it was his grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar, because there is no word for grandfather in the Hebrew and also in the Aramaic that this part of Daniel is written in. So we're not entirely sure whether or not Belshazzar, whether his mom was a widow of Nebuchadnezzar or one of Nebuchadnezzar's daughters. So we're not entirely sure about that, but regardless, he's very close to the family tie of Nebuchadnezzar. And she says, he had a man named Daniel, and he made Daniel the chief magician. He was over all the astrologers. He was over all the psychics. He was over all of the counselors, all of the advisors in the kingdom. He was smart. He was great at interpreting dreams. He was a problem solver. Let's go get Daniel. He can help us. And in a world that is increasingly rejecting our message, in a world that is increasingly rejecting the hope of Jesus, let's make sure that we as people who follow Jesus are resolved that we still carry out our lives so that we live in such a way that even though people in the world may reject what we have to offer and they may reject the hope of Jesus that we proclaim, that we still live our lives that in times of trouble, they turn to us. Let's make sure that we live our lives in such a way that we espouse the hope and the love of Jesus at all times, even to an unbelieving world, even when they have rejected our message. We still choose to respond in love and kindness and goodness, so that when they reach a point where they have nowhere else to turn and they don't know what else to do, they still think to call on us. And maybe we can use that opportunity to point them once again to the hope of Jesus. Verse 13, then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king answered and said to Daniel, you are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought from Judah. I have heard of you, that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me to read this writing and make known to me its interpretation. But they could not show the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. And then Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. Daniel says, keep them. I don't want anything from you. I'm going to serve you. You keep it. And I will read for you the inscription that the hand that appeared out of nowhere wrote on the wall that none of your advisors can figure out. I will interpret it for you. Now, we don't know why none of the other advisors couldn't read it. Maybe it was written in a language where only God would allow Daniel to read it, but we don't think so because of what happens later on. But maybe God put scales over the eyes of the others. We don't know. Maybe they were so wasted they couldn't see clearly. We don't know why, but what we do know is God brings in Daniel, and Daniel, who's been relegated to the sidelines since the death of Nebuchadnezzar, is brought in the time of need. You never fully know all that God is doing. You never fully know all that God is doing and all the ways that He is using you. You never fully know the story that God is writing through you at all times, in all the ways He is going about, all the people He's going to bring into your life, and all the ways that you can minister to people and encourage people and help people grow closer to Jesus. You never fully see that. Now, sometimes God in His providence gives us the benefit of looking back and seeing how He was weaving all of these things together. And it's so fantastic when you become friends with somebody. It's seemingly you had a chance encounter with somebody, but years later you look back and you see all of the ways that God was orchestrating something even bigger than you ever imagined. We never fully know all the ways that God is doing that or what God is fully up to. And Daniel's lived an extraordinary life up until this point. But in terms of the kingdom, he's an afterthought. He's done incredible things. But he's not really at the forefront. He's off to the sidelines. And it takes the queen to come back into the room to remember what he had done previously. But God wasn't done with him yet. Daniel launches into a history lesson. We're going to just summarize these next few verses. And he says, God gave your father or grandfather Nebuchadnezzar greatness. He gave him greatness. He ruled the world. The whole world revered and feared him. He would decide who would live. He would decide who would die. But in all that power, he became arrogant. And he became full of himself. And because of his arrogance, and because he was so full of himself, God humbled him. God humbled him and he took his glory away. Because God hates pride. God detests the proud. And then we see exactly what happened to King Nebuchadnezzar in verse 21, where we read these words. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. And you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. But you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. knew what happened to Nebuchadnezzar, but he chose to ignore it. He'd undoubtedly, as king, heard the stories when the empire was at its greatest, when Nebuchadnezzar was king. And then how he seemingly lost it instantaneously. How he went insane. The man that the whole world revered and feared was brought down to nothing. And you, Belshazzar, you chose to ignore this, in spite of the fact you knew all about it. And then what's he say, which is so prevalent in our culture today? He says, instead of you choosing to worship the Creator, you have chosen to worship creation. Instead of you choosing to worship the Creator, you've worshiped silver and gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. You've worshiped wealth. You've worshiped privilege. You've worshiped nature. You've worshiped all of the things that are created, and you have missed the fact that ultimately you need to worship the Creator. And then from his presence, the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed: Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Paris, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Judgment is declared. Judgment's declared. I mean, this is where we get the saying, the handwriting's on the wall. We all know the outcome. We can all see it. It just hasn't happened yet. And this is the sobering message that Daniel relays to the king. And then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple. A chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Now, what's there for us? Because again, the vast majority of us are not going to a drunken orgy tonight while the city around us is on fire. The vast majority of us are in Kings and all that. So what do we take from this? Well, the first, and we've already asked you, is how are you coping? How are you coping? Is there a dependency that's beginning? Is there just the fear and the uncertainty and the anxiety weighing to the point that you're chasing after peace and things that ultimately won't provide it? The next question is, who's in your life to speak into those things that could pull you aside and say, hey, I'm not saying that there's a problem, but I'm saying you might need to really take a hard look. And they're willing to pull you aside and say, hey, I wasn't saying before there is a problem, but now I'm telling you there is a problem. And you need to adjust this. Who loves you enough in your life that is willing to allow you to be mad at them? Because they're going to tell you the things you need to hear. not the things you want to hear. And ultimately, that's what love is. Ultimately, love is to pull somebody aside and tell them the hard truth. So who's that person for you? Who's there for you? I can do that. Remember, we don't know what God is always up to. We don't know all the ways that God is taking the story of our life and the story of others and bringing them alongside to accomplish something that we look back on sometimes and see exactly what God is up to, but sometimes we may never see that. But in the same way where Daniel had to think, well, the best days of God using me are behind me, or I'm never going to have an opportunity to... he's plucked off the sidelines, and he's thrown into this story. And he's used by God in a powerful way. Which I just want to encourage us, if you're not dead, you're not done. If you're not dead, you're not done. God still wants to do something through the story of your life. God wants to use you to accomplish great things for Him. He brings Daniel in from out of relative obscurity. Who in your life has rejected the hope of Jesus? And how have you responded? Do your friends, do your family know that even though they reject the truth, and even though they reject your conclusion, do they still know that in a moment where they have nowhere else to turn, and that will come for them, that they could still get a hold of you? That they could still be loved by you? You can't control their response. You can't control how they respond to you, but you as somebody who follows Jesus can control how you respond to them. And this is not an appeal for you to be an enabler to somebody. Because again, love oftentimes is telling people the hard truths they don't want to hear. But when their life hits against a wall and there's nowhere else for them to turn, do they know that you still love them? Are we, as people who love and follow Jesus, are we making sure that worshiping our Creator is at the forefront of all? That we want to honor our Creator and we keep that at the forefront and we don't fall prey to worshiping the creation over the Creator. Whether that's wealth or prestige or position, or nature, or any of those things. That we make sure in our hearts we worship the Creator. That's what we can take away. And in the midst of craziness, that's what we must cling to. God, I pray that we would be people who in times of uncertainty would turn to you. Not as something cliche or trite, or to think that's going to make everything instantaneously easy. But truthfully, God, it's the only thing that can sustain us. And we hear story after story in our world of sex and alcohol and drugs and food being used to fill a void. And yet every single time we're reminded that that void goes unfilled. Because there is nothing that is created that can fill that void. It must be filled by the Creator. So God, as people who've turned our lives to you, as people who've given you our lives and have a relationship with you through your Son, Jesus, I pray that we would set the tone. And saying nothing else is good enough. Nothing else is enough. That we need you. And not just in the midst of a pandemic, we need you every day of our lives. That we would link arms with each other. And we would love each other enough to have hard conversations. And we would all realize the need for people in our lives who tell us the things we don't want to hear sometimes. Because they're going to bring us closer to you. And God, that we would be people of hope. And in a world that increasingly rejects the hope, that we would be undeterred and we would still love and we would still point to you. God, that you would use us. And we wouldn't lose heart when we don't see how or what you're up to. We would trust you. And that we would have the privilege of partnering with you in just a small way. And pointing people to the Creator. Use us, God. Use this church. Use us, your people. That's our prayer. Help us love you. Help us love others. And let us get out of the way. In your Son, Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound to save a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. Hallelujah. Christ is risen from the grave. Hallelujah. Christ is risen from the grave. The prodigal is welcomed home, the sinner now saved. But the God who died came back to life, and everything has changed. Hallelujah. Christ is risen from the grave. Hallelujah. Christ is risen from the grave. Oh, death, where is your And on the day you call me in to heaven's sweet embrace, I see your scars, your open arms, the beauty of your face. And through tears of joy I lift my voice in everlasting praise. Hallelujah, Christ is risen from the grave. Oh death, where is your sting? Oh fear, where is your power? The mighty King of Kings has disarmed you, delivered and redeemed. Eternal life is ours. Oh, praise His name forever. Hallelujah. Christ is risen from the grave. Hallelujah. Christ is risen from the grave. And all throughout eternity, a song will be the same. Hallelujah. Christ is risen from the grave. Oh, Jesus is alive. Oh, and all throughout eternity, a song will be the same. Hallelujah. Christ is risen from the grave. And that's our hope. And that's the hope we have to take to the world. And we know that right now is a really hard time for people. So we want to help. And next week we're going to tell you even more details, but I want to let you know of something we're going to do in the month of November. We're going to do a food drive here at Lakeside. It's going to help people in our own church and in our own community. And if you have a need, you let us know. There's no questions asked. Nobody's going to know anything. But we're going to meet that need. If you know of somebody who has a need, you let us know. And we'll help meet that need. And this is going to go to help people in our context, in our church, and it's going to go to our community to help people see the love of Jesus on full display and to meet a tangible need during a really hard time. So we'll let you know more details about that beginning next week, but be on the lookout for that. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being part of Lakeside. If there's any way we can serve you, let us know. God bless you guys. See you again.